In the quiet town of Crescent Grove, Officer Daniel Thornton has spent years hiding from the grief of losing his wife. With no children to fill the void, his once vibrant home has become a place of silence. But when a call comes in about 6 orphan girls left to fend for themselves, everything changes. Against all odds, Daniel makes a life-altering decision. He takes them in, offering temporary shelter. What he doesn't expect is how deeply they will carve a place in his heart. As the days turn into weeks, the bond between Daniel and the girls strengthens. But in a town where whispers of prejudice linger, raising 6 black girls as a single white man is far from easy. Daniel must learn to navigate their trauma, cultural differences, and the prejudices they face while also confronting his own inner demons. Guided by a wise community leader, Daniel strives to prove that family is not defined by blood, but by love. Just as this makeshift family begins to find their way, a wealthy, estranged relative emerges, threatening to tear them apart. A legal battle ensues, and the stakes couldn't be higher. But when a stunning revelation about the relative's true intentions comes to light, Daniel must fight harder than ever to keep the family he never expected to find. In this heart-wrenching tale of resilience and love, the ties that choose us will make you question what it truly means to be family. Will Daniel and the girls overcome the ultimate test, or will they be torn apart by forces beyond their control? Daniel Thornton sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, watching as the small town of Crescent Grove passed by in a blur of familiar scenes. His hands gripped the steering wheel, not because the streets were difficult to navigate, but because it gave him something to focus on, something other than the quietness of his own thoughts. He could still picture Maya, his late wife, her laughter echoing in the kitchen as she tried to bake something that always came out burnt. Those were the days when life felt full, and the house echoed with more than just silence. He could almost hear her voice in his mind, urging him to stop working so hard, to find some joy again. But those words faded with time, just like her memory. Since she passed, the weight of his grief had filled the space she left behind, leaving him only with his work as an officer. His radio crackled to life, pulling him out of his thoughts. Dispatch to all units, we've got a call at 1456 Elm Street. Neighbors report possible child abandonment, multiple minors inside. Any available units, please respond. Daniel blinked, pushing back the cloud of memories. Abandoned children? He couldn't help but feel the weight of those words settle in his chest. He reached for the radio, his fingers moving almost automatically. Thornton here. I'll take it. He could hear the hesitation on the other end before dispatch responded. Copy that, Officer Thornton. Be safe. As he turned the wheel and headed toward the address, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this call was about to change everything. The small house at 1456 Elm Street looked run down, the kind of place that had seen better days, maybe years ago. Paint peeled from the siding, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Daniel stepped out of the car, scanning the house, his trained eyes searching for signs of movement. The street was eerily quiet, as if the world had paused, waiting for something to happen. He knocked on the door, his fist making a hollow sound against the wood. Police. Anyone home? Nothing. He tried again, louder this time. He thought he heard something faint, like the muffled sound of crying. His heart clenched, and he reached for the doorknob, testing it. It turned easily in his hand. The door creaked open, revealing a darkened hallway that smelled of neglect. Cautiously, he stepped inside, calling out again, "It's okay. I'm here to help." He followed the sound of soft sobbing, making his way through the dimly lit house until he reached the living room. There, huddled together in the corner of a barren room, were 6 little girls, their faces streaked with tears, their eyes wide with fear. The oldest girl, around 12, stepped forward, her small body trembling but her chin held high. "Are you here to take us away?" Daniel knelt down to their level, his voice gentle. "No, I'm here to help. What's your name?" "Leah," she whispered. "Our parents. They aren't coming back." As Leah spoke, the weight of her words sank into Daniel's chest. He looked around at the other girls, 5 pairs of scared eyes, clinging to one another as if they were the only thing holding each other up. The youngest, a tiny girl with tight curls, no older than 4, wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. She was shaking, her small body racked with sobs. "I'm so sorry," Daniel said, his voice thick. He stood up and reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need social services at 1456 Elm Street, immediately. We've got 6 minors in need of assistance." As he waited for backup, Daniel sat on the floor, closer to the girls. "It's going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure how. The girls remained silent, except for the youngest, Jasmine, who crawled over to Daniel, looking at him with wide eyes. Without a word, she climbed into his lap, resting her head on his shoulder. Daniel felt something in him crack wide open. "We'll figure this out," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Social services arrived shortly after, and the house bustled with activity. The girls were taken aside, questioned gently by a kind-faced social worker, while Daniel stayed by their side, watching the growing unease in Leah's face as the conversation about their future began. Leah, still standing protectively in front of her sisters, spoke up when the social workers suggested that the girls might have to be placed in separate homes. "We can't be apart," she said firmly, her voice wavering just enough to betray her fear. "You can't take us away from each other." The social worker gave her a sympathetic look. "Leah, I understand, but it's hard to place 6 siblings together." Daniel stood nearby, his hands fisting at his sides as he watched the scene unfold. He saw the way Leah's eyes hardened, how her lip trembled despite her best efforts to be strong. Something inside him shifted. What if I took them in? The room fell silent. Leah's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with confusion and hope. The social worker turned to Daniel, eyebrows raised. "Officer Thornton, that's a huge responsibility," she said carefully. "You'd be taking in 6 children, all dealing with significant trauma." "I know," Daniel said, surprising himself with his certainty. "But I can't just stand by and watch them be separated." The drive back to Daniel's house felt surreal. The girls sat quietly in the back of his patrol car, Leah's arm wrapped protectively around Jasmine, who had fallen asleep against her. The other girls whispered among themselves, but the air was thick with uncertainty. When they arrived, Daniel led them into his modest home, a place that had been too quiet for too long. The living room, once a space filled with emptiness, now felt full, too full. The girls hesitated at the door, unsure of whether they could step inside. "It's not much," Daniel said, feeling oddly vulnerable. "But it's yours for as long as you need." Leah glanced at him, still wary. "For how long?" "As long as you want," Daniel replied softly, not entirely sure what he was promising, but knowing it was the right thing to say. That night, after helping the girls settle in, Daniel sat alone at his kitchen table, staring into the empty space around him. He could hear soft whispers and muffled sobs coming from the room where the girls were sleeping. His heart felt heavy, but for the first time in years, it wasn't because of loss. It was because of the hope that maybe, just maybe, he was meant to be something more. As the night deepened, so did the realization that life as Daniel knew it was never going to be the same. Daniel Thornton woke up to the sound of clattering dishes and the unmistakable sound of laughter, something he hadn't heard in his home for a long time. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes as he listened to the giggles and the occasional squeal coming from downstairs. For a moment, he thought it was a dream. Then reality hit him. The girls. He quickly threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt and headed downstairs, where the chaos unfolded in front of him. Leah stood at the kitchen counter, trying to pour cereal into bowls, while Jasmine clung to her leg, looking up at her with wide eyes. Kara and Michaela were at the table, eating quietly, but Talia and Sienna were engaged in a tug-of-war over the last piece of toast. "Girls!" Daniel's voice cut through the noise, and they all froze. He wasn't used to raising his voice, and neither were they. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward him, all at different levels of surprise and uncertainty. Leah shot him a defiant look as she finished pouring the cereal. "We didn't want to wake you up." "It's all right," Daniel said, softening his tone, "but let's try to keep it down, okay?" Leah didn't respond, but the others nodded. Jasmine let go of Leah's leg and ran toward Daniel, holding up her arms. "Up," she said. Daniel's heart squeezed as he bent down and lifted Jasmine into his arms. "Breakfast time, huh?" She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it made Daniel feel more connected to her than he had been to anyone in years. The rest of breakfast was quieter, but the unease in the room was palpable. As Daniel tried to navigate the morning routine, helping the younger girls find their shoes and jackets, he couldn't help but feel like he was in over his head. After breakfast, the older girls prepared for school, while Jasmine and Talia stayed behind with Daniel. As they left, Daniel caught a glimpse of Leah standing by the door, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You okay?" he asked, walking over to her. She shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "We're fine. Leah, if something's bothering you, you can talk to me. I know this is all new, and—" "I said we're fine," she snapped, her eyes flashing with frustration. "You don't have to pretend to care. We know this isn't permanent." Daniel froze, taken aback by the bitterness in her voice. "What makes you think that?" Leah's expression hardened. "Because nobody stays. Not after things get hard." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He realized then that Leah wasn't just protecting her sisters. She was protecting herself. She had built walls so high that even his genuine concern wasn't enough to break through. "Leah, I'm not going anywhere," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady. "I made a promise to take care of you, and I'm going to keep it." Leah's eyes met his for a split second before she turned away. "Sure," she muttered before walking out the door, leaving Daniel standing there, wondering if he'd ever get through to her. Feeling lost, Daniel decided to visit Miss Evelyn at the community center. He had met her years ago during a charity event, and she had become a fixture in the town's Black community. If anyone could help him navigate this new chapter of his life, it was her. The community center was bustling with activity when Daniel arrived. Kids were playing in the yard, while inside, volunteers were preparing for an after-school program. Miss Evelyn stood near the entrance, her warm, wise eyes scanning the room as she coordinated everything with ease. "Officer Thornton," she greeted with a smile as Daniel approached. "What brings you here?" "I need your help," Daniel said, his voice thick with the weight of his request. He explained the situation with the girls, the challenges he was facing, and how he didn't know how to connect with them, especially Leah. Miss Evelyn listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. When he finished, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're doing a good thing, Daniel. But raising 6 Black girls in a town like this, especially with what they've been through, it's not going to be easy. They've lost their family, and now they're trying to figure out if they can trust you. That takes time. I don't want them to feel like I'm just some stranger looking after them," Daniel said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I want them to know that I'm here for them. But Leah, she doesn't trust me." Miss Evelyn smiled gently. "That's because she's afraid of being abandoned again. You need to show her that you're not just passing through, and you'll have to learn to meet them where they are." "What do you mean?" "You've got to understand their world, their culture, their experiences. If you don't, you'll always be on the outside looking in." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in her words. "How do I start?" Miss Evelyn's smile widened. "I'll teach you." Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself spending more time at the community center, learning from Miss Evelyn and getting to know the girls in a different context. She taught him how to braid their hair, showed him how to cook some of the dishes they missed from their mother's kitchen, and encouraged him to embrace the cultural differences that separated them. The more time Daniel spent with them, the more the girls started to open up. Sienna, who was usually full of energy and mischief, began to smile more, joining him on morning runs. Michaela, the quietest of the group, started reading with Daniel in the evenings, sharing her love of books. Kara, who had been shy and nervous, began to laugh more freely as she colored at the kitchen table. But Leah remained distant, watching from the sidelines with guarded eyes. Every time Daniel thought he was making progress, she pulled back. One evening, as Daniel was helping Jasmine with her homework, he noticed Leah standing in the doorway, her expression softer than usual. "Need any help?" Daniel asked, hoping to engage her. Leah shook her head, but for the first time, she didn't walk away. "You're really good with her," Leah said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. She reminds me of what it's like to be young and not have the weight of the world on your shoulders." Leah hesitated, as if trying to decide whether to say more. It's just different, you know? Having someone like you here. I know, Daniel said gently. But I'm trying, Leah. I really am. She nodded, but the walls remained. Still, for the first time, Daniel felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to break through. Things had just started to feel more settled when a knock on the door interrupted dinner one evening. Daniel opened it to find a woman from social services standing there, a clipboard in hand. Mr. Thornton, we need to discuss the girl's permanent placement, she said, her tone businesslike. There's been interest from a relative. The girls, who had been chatting at the table, fell silent. Leah's fork clattered against her plate as her face went pale. Daniel's heart sank. What do you mean, permanent placement? I thought we agreed they'd stay with me until things were sorted out. We did, the woman replied, glancing down at her clipboard. But a relative has come forward, and they're interested in taking custody. We need to review all options. Leah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I knew it, she spat, glaring at Daniel. I knew you weren't going to stay. You're just like everyone else. Daniel stepped forward, his voice desperate. Leah, no, I'm not like that. I didn't know about this. But Leah was already storming up the stairs, her sisters watching in stunned silence. The social worker looked uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton. This is just protocol. Daniel nodded numbly, his chest tight with dread. As the door closed behind the social worker, he looked at the staircase, where Leah had disappeared moments before. He knew in that moment that he had to prove to her, and to all of them, that he wasn't going to walk away, no matter what. Daniel stood in the school hallway, watching from a distance as the girls walked into their classrooms. It wasn't hard to notice the stares they received, the hushed whispers and occasional giggles from some of the other students. Michaela, the quiet one, kept her eyes down, clutching her book bag tightly. Sienna, on the other hand, walked with her head high, but Daniel could sense her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. After school that day, the girls were unusually quiet. Daniel tried to engage them during dinner, but they exchanged glances before falling back into silence. Sienna was the first to speak up. There were kids at school today. They called us names. Leah, who had been picking at her food, shot Daniel a sideways glance, her walls going up. This is why we don't fit here. What did they say? Daniel asked gently. Michaela shrugged, her eyes downcast. Stuff about our hair, our skin. Sienna's voice trembled with frustration. They said you're not really our dad, that we're just some kind of charity case. Daniel's heart sank. He had known the transition would be tough, but hearing this from them hit harder than he anticipated. I'm so sorry, girls. I know this is hard, but you have to know, no matter what anyone says, you're part of this family now. Leah's fork clattered against her plate as she stood up abruptly. They're right, though. You aren't our dad. The room fell silent. Leah's words hung in the air, her anger palpable. Daniel, at a loss for words, watched as she stormed out of the room, leaving the rest of them in uncomfortable silence. Later that evening, Daniel knocked softly on Leah's bedroom door. She didn't answer, but he opened it slightly, finding her sitting on the edge of the bed with her head in her hands. Leah, Daniel began, stepping inside cautiously. Can we talk? She didn't look up at first, her body tense and rigid. There's nothing to talk about. I know you're angry, he said, sitting on the chair across from her. And I understand why. You're going through so much, and I can't pretend to know exactly how you feel. But I want to help. I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Leah let out a bitter laugh. You say that now, but everyone leaves eventually. Daniel sighed, his heart aching for her. I'm not them, Leah. I don't know how to prove it to you, but I will. I'm here and I'm staying. For the first time, Leah's defenses cracked. She looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. You don't get it, she said, her voice trembling. I'm supposed to take care of them. I'm the one who's supposed to protect my sisters. You've done an incredible job, Daniel said softly, but you don't have to do it alone anymore. You don't have to carry this all by yourself. Leah wiped her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. But what if you leave, too? Daniel moved closer, sitting beside her on the bed. I won't. You can count on that. You don't have to believe me right now, but I'll prove it to you. We'll figure this out together. Leah didn't say anything, but she didn't pull away either. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In an attempt to bridge the emotional gap between them, Daniel decided to organize a family dinner. He wanted to create a moment of togetherness, something that might help the girls feel more at home. Miss Evelyn gave me this recipe, Daniel said, setting a dish of baked chicken on the table. The girls were scattered around the kitchen, each helping with different tasks. Michaela was setting the table, while Sienna and Kara argued playfully over who got to make the salad. Looks good, Leah commented dryly, her arms crossed. But she took her seat at the table anyway, and for Daniel, that felt like progress. As they sat down, the awkwardness was palpable. Conversation started and stopped in fits, and Daniel struggled to find common ground. Finally, he turned to the girls. I know things have been tough, he began, but I want us to try and do this together. We're a family now, and that means we look out for each other. Kara, always the sweet one, nodded eagerly. I like it here, she said softly. Jasmine, sitting next to Daniel, looked up at him with wide eyes. Me too, she echoed, her small hand slipping into his. Leah watched the interaction silently, but her expression softened ever so slightly. As dinner continued, the tension slowly ebbed, and for the first time, Daniel felt like they were starting to become a unit, a family. The more time Daniel spent with the girls, the deeper his attachment grew. The once quiet and lonely house was now filled with the sound of laughter, footsteps racing down the hall, and even the occasional argument over TV shows or who got the last cookie. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone in the living room, the house now eerily quiet. He glanced at the photos on the mantel, where a picture of Maya still sat. His heart ached for her, but it wasn't the same unbearable emptiness he had felt before. He had found something unexpected, something that gave him a sense of purpose again. As much as these girls needed him, he realized that he needed them just as much. They had given him something to fight for, something to love again. The realization both terrified and exhilarated him. He had grown attached to these girls, to this life. But what if he couldn't keep them? What if they were taken away? Daniel's worst fears came to life when social services scheduled a meeting with him a few days later. We've received an inquiry from a relative, the social worker explained as they sat across from each other in Daniel's living room. A woman named Sophia Reynolds. She's the girl's maternal aunt, and she's expressed interest in taking custody. Daniel's heart dropped. But the girls have been with me for weeks now. We're starting to build something here. The social worker nodded sympathetically. I understand, and I can see that you've formed a bond with them. But Sophia Reynolds has the resources and legal standing to make a claim. We'll have to consider all options. Leah, who had been eavesdropping from the hallway, stepped into the room, her face pale. What does that mean? Are we leaving? Daniel looked up at her, panic rising in his chest. No, Leah, we're not making any decisions yet. I'm not giving up on you. On any of you. Leah crossed her arms, her face a mixture of fear and anger. I knew this would happen. I knew it was too good to last. Daniel stood up, his voice firm but calm. Leah, listen to me. I'm going to fight for you. For all of you. I'm not letting anyone take you away. Leah stared at him for a long moment before turning and walking out of the room. The social worker gathered her things, looking uncomfortable. I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton, she said softly, but this is just the beginning. The courts will have the final say. As she left, Daniel stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of what was to come settle over him. He had promised Leah he wouldn't leave, but now, more than ever, he feared he might not have a choice. Daniel sat at the dining room table, a stack of papers spread out before him. His lawyer had gone over the details earlier that day, and though she tried to reassure him, the pit in his stomach wouldn't go away. The legal battle for the girls had officially begun, and now it was real. Sophia Reynolds, their wealthy estranged aunt, was challenging him for custody. He hadn't met her in person yet, but everything about her screamed power. She had the resources to fight for the girls and give them a life of luxury he could never provide. Still, Daniel knew in his heart that the kind of life she offered wasn't built on love. As he sifted through the documents, he heard the sound of small footsteps approaching. Leah stood in the doorway, watching him with that familiar, guarded expression. "Are we really going to court?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Daniel looked up, trying to hide the worry etched into his face. "It looks that way." Leah bit her lip, her eyes flicking between the papers and Daniel. "Sophia's rich, isn't she? She could give us everything we ever wanted." Daniel's heart sank at her words, but he knew they came from a place of uncertainty. "She might be able to give you things, Leah, but can she give you a home? Can she give you what we've built here?" Leah crossed her arms defensively. "What if that's not enough? What if it's better with her?" "I don't believe that for a second," Daniel replied gently, standing up and walking toward her. "I know this is confusing, and it's okay to feel torn. But you need to know that I'm going to fight for you. For all of you. Not because I have to, but because I want to." Leah's eyes flickered with emotion, but she turned away before he could read her thoughts. "I don't want to talk about this right now," she mumbled, disappearing back into the hallway. As the days passed, Daniel felt the tension growing in the house. The younger girls didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could sense the shift. Jasmine clung to Daniel more, always looking for reassurance, while the older girls seemed to withdraw into themselves, processing the looming court case in their own ways. One evening, Daniel found Michaela and Sienna whispering in the living room, their faces serious. When they noticed him, they quickly stopped talking. "What's going on?" Daniel asked, sitting down beside them. Michaela glanced at Sienna before speaking up. "Is it true that Sophia's really rich? Like, we could have a huge house and fancy clothes?" Daniel sighed, knowing this was going to be one of the hardest conversations he'd ever have. "Sophia does have a lot of money," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean she's the right person to take care of you. Money doesn't replace love, and it doesn't make a family. But wouldn't it be easier?" Sienna chimed in, her voice hesitant. "To live with someone who can give us everything we want?" Daniel leaned forward, looking each girl in the eye. "I know it might seem tempting, but having everything you want doesn't always mean you'll be happy. What we have here, it's not perfect, but it's built on trust and love. And that's what makes a family." Sienna crossed her arms, clearly not convinced. Michaela, on the other hand, seemed thoughtful, her brow furrowed as she processed his words. "I just want what's best for you," Daniel added softly. "And I think we've started to build something really special here. But no matter what happens, I need you to know that I love each of you, and I'm not giving up without a fight." Daniel met with his lawyer again the following week, this time to discuss the strategy for the custody hearing. It was the first time he truly felt the weight of what he was up against. Sophia had hired one of the best legal teams in the state, and they were preparing to argue that Daniel, a single white man in his 50s, couldn't possibly understand the needs of 6 young black girls. "You need to be ready for them to use everything against you," his lawyer, Rachel, explained. "They'll point out your lack of experience, your race, your financial situation. But what you have on your side is the emotional bond you've formed with the girls. We need to show the court that love and commitment are what matter most." Daniel nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes to keep them with me." Rachel smiled kindly. "You've already done so much for them, Daniel. Just remember that when things get tough." As the court date loomed closer, Daniel felt the pressure mounting. He knew the odds weren't in his favor, but he couldn't imagine his life without the girls. The thought of losing them to Sophia made his chest ache in ways he hadn't felt since Maya's death. Miss Evelyn became a constant presence in their lives during this time, providing not only emotional support but also practical help. She spent hours with the girls, teaching them about their heritage, helping them understand their identity, and reminding them that they were loved. One afternoon, Daniel sat with her at the community center, his hands gripping a cup of coffee. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," he admitted, his voice low. "I want to keep them, but I keep wondering if maybe they'd be better off with Sophia. Maybe she can give them something I can't." Miss Evelyn shook her head firmly. "Don't you dare think like that, Daniel. Those girls don't need money or fancy things. They need love. They need someone who sees them, who understands them, and who's willing to fight for them. And that's exactly what you're doing. But what if I'm not enough?" Daniel's voice cracked with vulnerability. I don't know if I'm capable of giving them everything they need. Miss Evelyn reached across the table and placed a hand on his. You've already given them something money can't buy, a home. A real home, where they feel safe and loved. And that's worth more than all the wealth in the world. Daniel blinked back tears, her words sinking into his heart. He knew she was right, but the fear of losing them still lingered, gnawing at him every day. The day of the first court hearing arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. Daniel, dressed in his best suit, sat at the front of the courtroom, his hands tightly clasped together. Beside him sat Rachel, ready to present their case, while Sophia and her team sat across from them, exuding confidence. The judge, a stern-looking woman with piercing eyes, entered the room, and the proceedings began. Sophia's lawyer stood first, outlining her case. Sophia had the resources, the stability, and the family connection to provide for the girls. They argued that, despite Daniel's good intentions, he was ill-equipped to handle the complex needs of 6 black girls growing up in a predominantly white town. As they spoke, Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. Everything they said cut deep, feeding into his own insecurities. But when it was Rachel's turn to speak, she stood tall and unwavering. Your Honor, what my client has built with these girls is not something that can be measured by wealth or status. It's a bond forged through love, care, and commitment. Officer Thornton has been there for them through their darkest moments, offering them stability and security when they had no one else. This case isn't about money. It's about what's in the best interest of these children, and that is the home they found with him. The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable. When the hearing ended, the tension in the room was palpable. The judge announced that she needed more time to consider the case and set a date for the next hearing. As Daniel left the courtroom, the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. He had done everything he could, but now it was in the hands of the court. All he could do was hope that the love he had for the girls would be enough to see them through. Leah had always been observant, but in Sophia Reynolds' large and opulent home, something felt off. She had been visiting Sophia under court-mandated supervision, and while Sophia showered them with gifts and luxurious outings, the affection felt hollow. That day, after another shopping trip where the younger girls giggled over their new clothes, Leah caught a glance of Sophia in the hallway. She was on the phone, speaking in a low, urgent tone. I didn't take them in to play nanny, Sophia hissed into the phone. Once I get control of the trust, the girls can stay with their foster care handlers or whoever, but I'll handle the finances. Leah's blood ran cold as she listened. Sophia's words confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't about family. It was about money. For a moment, Leah stood frozen, then quietly backed away before Sophia could notice her. She knew what she had to do. Later that evening, after the younger girls had fallen asleep in their lavish guest rooms, Leah decided she couldn't keep this information to herself any longer. She found Sophia in the sitting room, sipping wine and scrolling through her phone. Sophia, Leah began, her voice firm. Sophia looked up, startled but quickly masking her surprise with a smile. What is it, Leah? I heard you earlier, Leah said, cutting straight to the point. I know why you really want us here. Sophia's face faltered for a moment before she set down her glass. Leah, honey, I don't know what you think you heard, but don't lie to me, Leah snapped, her anger barely contained. You don't care about us. You only care about the money. You were never planning to keep us, were you? For a moment, Sophia's mask of warmth slipped, revealing the cold calculation underneath. Leah, you're a smart girl, she said slowly. You know how the world works. I'm offering you and your sisters a chance at a better life, one Daniel could never give you. Leah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. A life without love? That's not a life at all. Sophia's expression hardened. Love doesn't pay the bills, Leah. You'll thank me one day when you're living the life you deserve. Leah didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made her decision. Daniel was her real family, and she had to tell him the truth. It was late by the time Leah returned to Daniel's house, but she didn't care. She knocked on the door, her heart racing. Daniel opened it, surprised to see her standing there, tears streaming down her face. Leah, he said, concerned. What's going on? Leah stepped inside, her voice trembling as she recounted what she had overheard at Sophia's. Daniel listened, his face growing darker with every word. When she finished, he pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that," Daniel said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "But I'm proud of you for coming to me. We're going to fix this, Leah. I promise." Leah pulled back, wiping her eyes. "I don't want to live with her. I don't want to lose you." "You won't," Daniel said firmly. "We're going to fight this together. You, me, and your sisters. We're a family, and we're not letting anyone tear us apart." For the first time in a long time, Leah felt a sense of relief wash over her. She realized that Daniel wasn't just a temporary guardian. He was her father in every way that mattered. The next morning, Daniel and Leah met with Rachel, Daniel's lawyer. Leah told her everything she had overheard, and Rachel immediately set to work. They gathered evidence, combing through Sophia's financial records and uncovering the truth. Sophia's interest in the girls had always been about gaining control of their parents' trust fund, a vast sum of money left behind for their future. "I knew something wasn't right with her," Rachel said, flipping through the documents. "This is exactly what we need. We'll present this in court." Leah sat quietly in the corner, still processing everything. She had thought that living with Sophia might be a chance for a better life. But now she saw the truth. Family wasn't about wealth or luxury. It was about love, and Daniel had shown her and her sisters more love than Sophia ever could. Rachel looked up from the papers and smiled at Leah. "You did the right thing coming forward. This will change everything." The day of the final custody hearing arrived, and the courtroom was filled with tension. Sophia sat with her high-powered legal team, looking as composed as ever. Daniel sat with Rachel and the girls by his side, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Sophia's lawyer presented their case first, once again emphasizing Sophia's wealth and ability to provide a stable home for the girls. But when Rachel stood to present their evidence, the courtroom fell silent. "We have reason to believe that Miss Reynolds' intentions in seeking custody are not in the best interest of the children," Rachel said, handing over the documents. "This evidence shows that her primary motive is to gain control of the trust fund left behind by the girls' parents, not to care for the children themselves." The judge reviewed the documents, her expression unreadable. Then, she called Leah to the stand. Leah took a deep breath as she walked to the witness stand, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never spoken in a courtroom before, but she knew this was her chance to tell the truth. "Leah," the judge said kindly, "can you tell me in your own words why you want to stay with Officer Thornton?" Leah looked over at Daniel, who gave her a reassuring nod. Then she turned back to the judge, her voice steady. "Daniel is the only real family we have," she said. "He's taken care of us, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He's given us love, a home, and a chance to be happy again. I know Sophia can give us fancy things, but that's not what we need. We need someone who loves us. And that's Daniel." The courtroom was silent as Leah finished speaking. The judge nodded, taking in her words. "I believe you, Leah," she said gently. "Thank you for your honesty." After several long, agonizing minutes, the judge finally spoke her ruling. "I find that Officer Thornton is the best fit for these children's emotional and physical well-being," she declared. "The girls will remain in his custody." A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom. Daniel closed his eyes, tears of joy and gratitude filling them. Leah and the other girls rushed to him, hugging him tightly as the weight of the past few months lifted off their shoulders. They were a family, and nothing could change that. The courtroom was silent, the tension almost suffocating. Daniel sat with the girls around him, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. Across the room, Sophia sat calmly, her face a mask of indifference, though Daniel could sense her confidence wavering after Leah's testimony. The judge's voice cut through the silence, commanding everyone's attention. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing from both parties, it's clear that this case is about more than just legal guardianship. It's about what is truly in the best interest of these 6 young girls. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced at Leah, sitting beside him with her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She caught his eye and gave a small, reassuring nod. No matter what the judge decided, they had fought together as a family. The judge continued, Officer Daniel Thornton has demonstrated a commitment to these children that goes beyond obligation. His actions show a deep love and understanding for the girls, despite the challenges that come with their unique situation. Furthermore, the revelations about Miss Reynolds' intentions have raised serious concerns about her suitability as a guardian. Sophia's face tightened, her carefully composed expression slipping for the first time. I hereby grant full legal custody of Leah, Michaela, Sienna, Kara, Talia, and Jasmine to Officer Daniel Thornton. The courtroom erupted into applause and cheers, but Daniel barely heard it. His world narrowed to the sight of the girls rushing toward him, their arms wrapping around him, tears streaming down their faces. He held them tightly, his own tears mixing with theirs. We did it, Leah whispered, her voice choked with emotion. We're staying. Yes, we are, Daniel replied, his voice thick with relief and gratitude. We're a family now, for good. The days following the court decision were a whirlwind of emotions. Daniel couldn't believe it was finally over. The fear of losing the girls had weighed so heavily on him. But now, as he watched them settle back into their routines, he felt lighter than he had in years. One evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, watching as Michaela and Sienna worked on their homework. Leah was in the living room, reading a book, while Kara and Talia played with Jasmine on the floor. The house, once quiet and lonely, now buzzed with life. You know, Leah said, appearing in the kitchen doorway, it still doesn't feel real. Daniel smiled. It'll sink in. We're all still adjusting, but we've got time now. No more court hearings, no more uncertainty. Leah hesitated before stepping closer. I just wanted to say thank you for fighting for us, for not giving up. Daniel stood, walking over to her and placing a hand on her shoulder. You don't need to thank me, Leah. I wouldn't have it any other way. You girls are my family now. That's all that matters. Leah nodded, blinking back tears. It's just, I never thought anyone would fight for us like that. Daniel pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. I'll always fight for you. Always. A few weeks later, Daniel took the girls to a cultural festival at Miss Evelyn's community center. It was a bright, sunny day, and the air buzzed with excitement. There were stalls filled with food, music, and performances, all celebrating the rich heritage of the town's Black community. Miss Evelyn greeted them with a wide smile. Look at this beautiful family, she said, hugging each of the girls. You've all grown so much. As they walked through the festival, the girls laughed and played, joining in with the dancing and sampling the food. Daniel watched them with a sense of pride and contentment. They were thriving, each in their own way, and the bond between them had never been stronger. Thank you for everything, Miss Evelyn, Daniel said, as they stood off to the side, watching the girls. You don't need to thank me, Miss Evelyn replied with a chuckle. You did all the hard work, Daniel. You opened your heart to those girls, and that's what made all the difference. Daniel nodded, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. Miss Evelyn smiled warmly. You didn't need guidance, Daniel. You just needed to trust yourself. Those girls see you as their father because you are. Family isn't about blood. It's about love and commitment, and you've given them both. Daniel's heart swelled with emotion as he watched the girls, their laughter ringing out across the festival grounds. They were a family now, in every sense of the word. That evening, after the festival, Daniel sat on the porch with Leah beside him. The younger girls had gone to bed, their laughter and energy still lingering in the air. Leah leaned back in her chair, gazing up at the stars. I used to dream about having a family, she said softly, but it was always this distant, impossible thing. Now, I don't know. I never thought it would be like this. Daniel looked over at her, sensing the vulnerability in her voice. What did you imagine? I don't know, Leah said with a shrug. Just something different. But this is better than anything I could have imagined. It feels real. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It is real, and it's ours. No one can take that away from us now. Leah smiled, a small but genuine expression of contentment. I'm glad we stayed. So am I, Daniel replied, his voice filled with emotion. You girls have given me more than you'll ever know. Leah looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper. You're the only dad we've ever had, and I'm proud of that. Daniel's heart swelled with pride, and he reached over to squeeze her hand. I'm proud of you too, Leah. More than you'll ever know. The next morning, the house was filled with the usual chaos. Sienna was chasing Talia around the living room, while Michaela tried to mediate an argument between Kara and Jasmine over a toy. Leah sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and watching the scene unfold with a bemused expression. Looks like another normal day, Leah remarked, raising an eyebrow at Daniel as he entered the room. Daniel chuckled, leaning against the counter. Normal's good. I can live with normal. The girls' laughter echoed through the house, filling it with warmth and life. Daniel watched them, his heart full. It hadn't been an easy journey, but standing there in that moment, he knew it had all been worth it. Later that evening, they all gathered around the dinner table, a tradition that had become a staple in their lives. As they ate and talked about their day, Daniel found himself gazing around the table at the girls, his daughters. Each one had faced unimaginable challenges, but they had come through stronger together. As they finished dinner and the dishes were cleared away, Daniel lingered at the table, watching them. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but they would face them as a family, united by love and the ties they had chosen. And that, Daniel realized, was the greatest gift of all.